Thank you, Professor Crenshaw, and now some replies from Professor Hare.
Thank you for the comments, which have been helpful. I can't respond to all of them. I'll take the three main points in the same order. The first point is about animals being regarded as part of the household. Nathan's parable is not, says Professor Crenshaw, to be taken literally. When we consider its genre, we see that it is a fanciful image, not accurate information. But my point is not about whether the story is literal or not, but about a conceptual connection present in that context. The lamb is like a daughter. The same is true with the story of Jonah. I'm not interested in whether this is history in some 18th century sense. Again, there is a conceptual connection. The animals are clothed in sackcloth. Job's friends offer sacrifices, says Crenshaw, that were not part of their household. But the text is silent about the source of the 7 bullocks and 7 rams. On my view, animals become part of the household by acquisition, even if they were not before. Crenshaw says that when Solomon sacrificed 1,000 burnt offerings at Gibeon, this would equal the number of his wives, and so, he says, fiction has here replaced fact. But again, my point is not about historicity, but about a conceptual connection. Solomon's extraordinary expense exactly shows the extraordinary extent of his household. Crenshaw does not think that the prophetic images of the end time imply vegetarianism. He says that the focus is not on animals except to stress the taming of wild beasts to ensure the safety of people. But the text says not only that a little child shall lead them, but puts together the wolf and the lamb, the leopard and the kid, the calf and the lion, the cow and the bear, and says the lion shall eat straw like the ox. They all of them shall not hurt or destroy in all of my holy mountain. I cannot see the emphasis where Crenshaw locates it. Domestication, he says, does not alter genetic makeup. But it does. The animals we breed are different biologically from their wild ancestors. On the second point, Crenshaw says that the moral gap functions to exonerate the deity by shifting blame to humans. But it could only do this if either we do not do evil, or we are not responsible for the evil we do. I don't think either of those claims is true. Crenshaw thinks that there is a canonical witness to God having sex with Eve. His evidence is a word in Genesis 4:1, where Eve says, "I have begotten a man from the Lord." The verse starts, "And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain." Proverbs 8 uses erotic language for the relationship between God and wisdom, but I feel like using Crenshaw's own remarks about not taking texts too literally. On the third point, Crenshaw thinks it strange to believe that our deaths are in God's hands as well as our lives. I do not know how to argue the contrary in a sentence, but the thought is perfectly familiar from within the life of faith. He thinks that the divine presence was problematic to many in Israel. But on my reading of Scripture, they did want the presence, but they also wanted holiness, the two things together and not disastrously apart. Crenshaw asks, did anyone other than priests who had much to gain really think so highly of sacrifices? Clearly opinions were divided, as Hare acknowledges, he says, but I don't acknowledge this. The prophetic critique of sacrifice, I suggested, is directed at renewal and reform and not at replacement. Finally, Crenshaw thinks a good God could not command animal sacrifice. But he does not comment on my point from Maimonides, which is important to the paper, and which I should probably have emphasized more than I did. I did not try to argue that animal sacrifice is now commanded by God. Maimonides took the same position. If we ask, why did God command it then? The suggestion is that God was again making a concession. The context was a people who were used to sacrificing to idols. God required them to make the sacrifices only to God. We might add that God replaced human sacrifice by animal sacrifice, as in the story of the binding of Isaac. This view is not the evolutionist view I condemned, that thinks of sacred history as having a primitive stage of magic and an advanced stage of ethics, but it does hold that God's commands, like those of human parents, are given in relation to our development.
Well, thank you to both of our speakers, and now we turn the discussion over to you. The floor is open for questions, and again, make sure that you use the microphones that are available. We have a question over, yes?
Front or back?
Front.
Thank you, Professor Hare. I really enjoyed your paper. I was wondering if you could just say some more about the idea of evaluative transfer, in particular, the kind of identification that you think needs to be there. And I'm wondering about someone who says, yeah, this is actually a familiar psychological thing, but no one's ever actually really justified in feeling like this. And so, especially if it has to do with things like guilt, merit, praise, and blame. So perhaps we can experience the goods and harms that befall people that we identify with. But like one of your examples, someone being ashamed of something her parents did, you could imagine someone feeling like that and a friend coming to her and saying, well, you know, really, this is starting to crush you. You're really not to blame for this. And it might feel like that. And it's intelligible, but
Yes.
at some level it doesn't really make sense, especially because, you know, these moral notions have to do with the evaluations of actions and the motivations for those actions. And this really wasn't your action. It really wasn't, they weren't your reasons that are at stake here that we're evaluating and talking about, you know, guilt and praise, and the same thing with the basketball case. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of say more about that, especially with someone who's kind of skeptical that this really is a justifiable way of feeling, even if it's a familiar one.
Yeah. So I think Kant would have agreed with you in most of what you've said there. But let me give you a counterexample. When I became a faculty member at Calvin College, I was required to sign on to various documents, like the Belgic Confession and the Canons of Dort, things like that, which I hadn't read before. Now, what was the function of that? I think that it had the function of making me proud of some things and ashamed of other things that a particular community had done. I entered by that signature into a community for which pride and shame were appropriate. Was that simply a psychological state? Well, no, I think I did actually become part of that community. And I had the psychological consequences. I did start to become ashamed and proud. But I don't think that the psychology was an illusion. I think it corresponded to something that actually occurred.
Louise here.
I'd like to ask Professor Hare about something that's actually come up in a couple of other sessions, so maybe it isn't fair to give you this question, but there's been an appeal made several times to some things being a concession to human nature, or a concession to the way the Hebrews were at the time, or something. And I have two quick questions about that. I'm just not clear how the point about it being a concession is supposed to work. So, first of all, why did God create creatures that had natures that had to be conceded to in that way? And secondly, if he did create them because there was some greater good that was achieved by creating creatures with those natures, and then making concessions to them, why don't we get the same slack now? We haven't changed.
Oh, well, On the first point, I believe that it's a good thing that we freely worship God, and that God created us with that good in mind. But for it to be free, it has to be the case that we can both choose right and choose wrong. If we'd been vegetarians? Yeah, if he'd made us like broccoli, then we wouldn't have had the chance of freely worshipping God. What? Oh, sorry, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Well, yes, I think that, at least according to the account in Genesis, we were created to eat vegetables. But we did have the free choice to prefer eating animals. Now, God could have, in this case and in every other case, created us in such a way that we inevitably chose right, but it wouldn't have been choice. Yeah.
Giving us a strong, powerful desire to eat meat. I mean, many vegetarians report a real sense of loss when they give it up. Some vegetarians are revolted by meat, but I mean, there are lots of things that we could choose to eat, and maybe some people do. I'm sure there's an internet site devoted to odd things people eat, but we don't have a positive desire to eat styrofoam, for example.
Well, no. It's hard. It's actually hard for us to know how naturally strong the desire to eat meat is, because if we've grown up in a carnivorous culture and then we give it up, then there are all sorts of cultural cues that we're given constantly to eat meat. So what you need to investigate is cultures that are from centuries vegetarian, and are they missing meat? And I don't know the answer to that. That would be the question, though. But now there was a second part to your question.
It seems to be just the same in terms of our basic nature, so why don't we get the same desire?
And I don't. I think we're the same in some ways, and we're different in others. I think that the difference that's relevant here is, if we're talking about, say, the genocide of the Canaanites, we've been given a picture of loving the enemy, which wasn't previously available to us. A call, you might say, to love the enemy. And that's changed us.